Hey guys, today we're going to talk a little bit about reading and writing about fiction. First thing I want us to think about is where we see stories in our everyday lives. And if we were in an actual classroom, I would give you guys a little bit of time to think about this and talk about this. So just take a couple seconds to think about that. Where do we see stories in our everyday lives? Some of the most obvious places, of course, are going to be TV and movies, right? We're all familiar with those stories, whether they last a half hour in a sitcom or 3.5 in some epic movie, right? We see these stories. Songs, another place we definitely hear stories. Dreams, sort of a situation where our subconscious is creating our own stories. In history, we hear stories, right? And we tell stories when we tell somebody about our day, for instance. So a lot of our day is spent hearing and telling stories. So we're fairly familiar with a lot of these aspects, I think, that we're going to talk about today, although we might not have the formal terms for them necessarily. So what we're going to talk about today are some methods of fiction. And all of these will be fair game for essay topics. The way essays will work in this class is I'll give you a couple of ideas for topics, but then you can always design your own topic if you have something that you're interested in exploring more. So first one I want to talk about is tone. Okay, and this is the mood of the piece. And one thing you want to pay attention to with tone is the word choice. The authors have chosen these words very carefully, oftentimes to set a specific tone. There's a really great example of this in your book. On page 7, there's an excerpt from Araby, and it says, "North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of the decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces." So there are a lot of words here that the author has chosen to set this sort of dreary and detached tone. We have the word blind twice. We have set the boys free and prison, so we have this sort of confined tone set there. We have detached, we have brown, imperturbable. So we get this very sort of lonely and isolated and contained tone. And of course that plays a part in sort of some things that happen later in that story. But if you're interested in really looking at word choice, tone is an interesting thing to look at in these stories. Next is plot, and this is the sequence of events in a story. And you want to be really careful when looking at this that your essay doesn't just turn into a plot summary, that you're not simply rehashing what's happened in the story. So if you're interested in looking at plot, you might think about what the events lead up to, how the events build on one another, why these events matter, how if a certain event had been different, the whole outcome might have been different. So what is the significance of these particular events? Plot is totally fine to look at, totally fine to write about, but just make sure that it's not turning into plot summary. Okay? Next is characterization. And with characterization, you want to look at how the characters are described, but you also want to look at how they interact with their surroundings and how they interact with other characters. That can really tell you some sort of interesting things about the character, especially if it's told in first person, if the character sort of has control over what you hear in the narrative. You can learn some facts that they might not reveal about themselves based on how they interact with other characters. So that's sort of interesting to look at. Is there something, the character says, I'm this type of person, but the way you see them interacting gives you a different impression. That can sort of add some layers to the character that might be interesting to look at. Page 8 in your book has a really good example of breaking down characterization. So if you're interested in dealing with that but need some help, that's a really great place to look. Also, you can look at setting. And setting can be the physical setting, which could broadly be something like what country or city does this take place in. But it can also very specifically be what room does this take place in, what couch does this take place on. So very specific things in this physical setting can be important as well. But setting can also refer to the historical time or the social situation. So how do those things inform the story? If this was set in a different historical time, if the social situation was different, if something in the setting changed, what changes about the story? You can also look at point of view. And this can be really interesting. This is simply who's telling the story. And most fiction is either first person or third person. First person is I, me. So I am telling you this story. You're seeing it through my lens. Second person is you. Okay, so the you is addressed throughout second person. A lot less common in fiction. Pretty hard to sustain for a whole piece without it starting to sound weird. Lori Moore is an author that does a fantastic job with this, but it's pretty rare. So when telling the story in first person, I, me, this is my perspective, you get a really intimate look at the situation from a single character, which is sort of the way our lives work, right? We have a very intimate look at our life, the way we see it, through our eyes. So that's a fairly familiar viewpoint to hear a story from. Also, there's third person, and that's he, she, they. When you're telling a story in third person, you have to also pick a level of omniscience. So you might get third person omniscience, which is sort of inside everybody's head. He knows that narrator knows what's going on inside everybody's head, which can be really interesting, right? So these two characters have this interaction, and then the narrator can actually see inside both their heads to tell us how they sort of felt about this interaction. So that can be sort of interesting, and some of that can get sort of tangled when you're keeping track of what actually happened, how the different characters reacted, what their real thoughts are about it. But sometimes stories are told in third person, limited omniscient, which means that the narrator just focuses on the thoughts of a single character, which is still a little bit different than first person, because with first person, the narrator is totally controlling the narrative to just be what he or she wants you to see. With a third person limited omniscient, we're going to see it through a single person's eyes, but the narrator is outside of that a little bit. So he can tell us, maybe some of the deep, dark thoughts that the narrator wouldn't tell us if the narrator was the character, him or herself. We can get those from a third-person limited omniscient narrator, which can be sort of interesting as well. So point of view, definitely fair game for essays if you're interested in looking at that. Irony, also a topic you could tackle. With irony, you want to look for what we as readers know about the characters that they might not know about themselves. So that can often lead to some interesting ideas about irony. And then finally, theme, which your book tells you is an underlying idea or a statement that a work makes about its subject. So is the work making a comment on how men and women relate to one another? Is it making a statement on growing up? And the important thing here is that you need to sort of dissect and look at what that statement is. So not just that the story is talking about how men and women interact, but what it's saying about how men and women interact. Or not just that it's making a statement about growing up, but what is that statement? Is that journey from innocence to experience that we'll look at a lot in this first unit? Is that primarily a tragic journey? Is it a journey of loss, or is it a primarily comical journey? I mean, all of us had pretty hilarious things happen to us, I imagine, as we went through our adolescence. So is it primarily comical? Is it primarily tragic? Or is there some of both? What kind of statement is the author making on whatever topic he or she is writing about? So you can definitely look at theme as well. And you'll see as you start looking at one of these elements how they're all sort of woven together. Breaking down a story into these elements can be really, really helpful, so you're not sort of overwhelmed and looking at all these things at once. It can make it a lot more manageable, but as you look at one element, you might see, well, I'm looking at point of view, but really I need to bring in this point about characterization, because they're so tightly woven together, and that's perfectly fine. Make sure, of course, as you're actually picking an essay topic and writing that essay, that you pick a nice, focused thesis statement, but you'll see that there is a lot of overlap in some of these topics. One last thing, on pages 10 and 11, there are some questions for exploring fiction. This is a really great place to start. If you're having trouble understanding or analyzing a specific text, start by going through these questions. A lot of the questions are easy enough that you'll sort of have an answer that you can start with, but if you really spend some time writing about them, I think you're going to get some pretty interesting insights for your essay. So start with those questions if you're just having trouble sort of finding an entryway into some of these stories. So hopefully those thoughts about fiction will help as you're reading these, as you're getting your discussion posts written, as you're starting to think about that first essay topic. We'll also, of course, be reading poetry in class, so the next short lecture will be about poetry. Thanks.